everyone, my name's Annette and welcome to Cotto Verde. It's a gorgeous day here in South Buckinghamshire in the UK. This is equivalent to a Zone 8B in the US. So we live in the countryside and we're lucky enough to have a walled garden, and this video is about some more structure that we're adding to our garden this year. So at the moment the garden has got a few flower beds, but it doesn't have enough permanent structure, and we're in the process of creating more beds and adding that structure to it so that there's more interest throughout the year. What I'm going to do in the video today is talk about the pine trees that we've chosen for these spots in our garden, and I'm going to explain a little bit about each one of them, and then I'm going to show you where we planted them and why we chose these particular positions, and also how we planted them, because it's very important with trees this size. These trees are nearly 8 foot tall, and it's really important to give them a good start. If you're going to plant a large tree, then you've really got to give it the best opportunity to get rooted in and settled. Depending on when you're watching this video, you may not know that this is the beginning of February, the very beginning of February, and it's still fine to plant trees in our zone at this time of year. Really, you need to plant them, through the winter, late autumn through the winter, because that's when trees are dormant, and they will give them a chance to root in really well before they start springing into action and leafing out. Obviously with evergreens, they've got leaves throughout the winter anyway, but they do have growth spurts, and those are typically in spring. So it is a good idea to get them in the ground before spring and before, they need all that extra water in order to sustain their new growth. So we've managed to get them in the ground this weekend. It's been really frozen up until now, so we just haven't been able to dig the ground well enough. So we waited until our first opportunity, which was this weekend, and it did take a good long while because we had to dig them all by hand. Well, when I say we, it's the royal we, because Richard did all the digging, because I have a bad shoulder and he's better at it, so he doesn't mind getting mucky and doing really heavy digging, and he did a really good job. Apparently there are over 100 different species of pine trees throughout the world, and I've chosen 2 different ones, and I'm going to talk about this one behind me first. This one is called Pinus radiata, or the Monterey pine. So the Monterey pine, as you can probably guess from its name, comes from the Northern California coastal areas and Mexico, that sort of region. And here in the UK, it has a hardness zone of H6, which I believe is zone 7 to 10 in the US. But I have read that it can tolerate temperatures very briefly up to minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, but it won't grow well if it's, regularly hits those temperatures. It's just not going to do well, and you'd be better off choosing a different type of pine tree. So the Monterey pine is really fast growing. It's the most widely planted pine tree in the world, and it's going to grow up to about 15 to 30 meters. It can get even taller than that if it's like a specimen tree on its own in like a big parkland. If there isn't anything else around it, or if it's on the coast or something, it could get much taller than that. But generally speaking, in gardens, it will grow to about 15 to 30 meters. And these pine trees, interestingly, grow quite slowly when they're young, and then as they get older, they just grow much faster, which I think I find that fascinating. The Monterey pine likes full sun, but it can also be planted in part shade. And as you can see from the picture behind me, the tree behind me, that the top half is in full sun at the moment, and the bottom half is now in shade. So it's going to get full sun right the way through to midday or after, and then it will gradually be in shade for the rest of the afternoon. And I think that's perfectly sited here. It's near our wall, which is a really tall, I don't know, it's probably about 10 foot tall, but we've planted it 4 meters away from the wall, so it's going to have plenty of room to grow breadth-wise. It shouldn't ever end up hitting the wall, and in fact, possibly by the time it's that wide, it'll be taller than the wall anyway, and then the bottom half will be more trunk than anything else. The reason I've chosen this spot also is because I really wanted a little bit of shade for a pond. I really wanted a little bit of shade for a pond that we're going to have in this area. Hopefully, again, that might happen this year. I would really like it to. But it's really good to have some shade for ponds, and that's why I've chosen to put an evergreen here in this spot. So Monterey pines have these upwards pointing branches with rounded tips, and the needles are really bright green, and they're about 8 to 15 centimeters long. That's about 3 to 6 inches. And the bark is like this lovely fissured dark grayish brown bark, which I really love. So the needles are gorgeously soft. You can tell it's a pine because it's got like 2 needles coming out of each one of these little things off the branch. So this gorgeous tree next to me here is called a Pinus sylvestris, which is the Scots pine, sometimes called the Scotch pine. It's got smaller needles than the Monterey pine. They're not quite as soft probably. It smells just as gorgeous, and as you can see, it's upward facing. This one is slightly taller, so this one's probably about 9 or 10 foot tall, and again it's really fast growing, but the Scots pine prefers to be in full sun, so I don't know whether it would tolerate shade, some shade, but it supposedly prefers full sun, and that is where I've planted it. This is just going to get sun all day long. The Scots pine's got a hardiness rating of H7 here in the UK, so it likes full sun, but it can tolerate, you know, coastal zones, coastal areas, so, you know, cold winds. It's got a deep taproot like the Monterey pine does, so it's going to do really well in coastal areas, but it will also do well in an urban setting. So this tree, the Scots pine, can grow to 12 meters tall in about 20 to 50 years, and the reason they give such a broad range of the number of years, 20 to 50 years, is because it's very dependent on what's surrounding it. So if it's planted close to other trees, then it's just not going to grow as fast. If it's planted in maybe not in full sun, then it really won't grow very fast, you know, so it's very dependent on those types of things, whether it reaches its full height potential and how fast it gets there. But it is fast growing, which is another reason that I've planted this tree here, because we're going to kind of use it as a bit of screening from the property that's next door. It's quite far away, but it's good for screening. But I'm really sorry if you could hear them putting up scaffolding next door. I think it's quite loud because it's very quiet here, but hopefully it's not picking up too much of that noise. Feels like every time I start speaking, they start screwing and scaffolding. So the Scots pine is known to have what's called an irregular shape. So it starts off when it's young as this sort of lovely pyramid shape, you know, where it's, you know, narrow at the top, wider at the bottom, and then as it gets older, it's inclined to lose its branches. So the lower branches will just start falling off, you know, not randomly one night. Well, I suppose randomly one night, yes. So it will lose its lower branches, and then it becomes this sort of umbrella, parasol-y shape on the top, and that's where it can be quite irregular, and it might lean one way or the other depending on winds, you know, if it's planted on the coast, or depending on what trees are planted around it. I did read that actually it goes really well with silver birch, and we've got 4 silver birch in our garden, and one of them is quite close, so that's a good thing. We just happen to have silver birch here already. They were one of the first trees that we planted. So the Scots pine's got kind of twisted grey-green needles. It's got like this fissured craggy bark, and as it gets older, like underneath, as it peels off, it's kind of orangey, which is really interesting. And in fact, this tree, I guess because it's a little bit taller and therefore older, has actually got some fissured bark already. In order to put this Scots pine in here, we had to take a rowan tree out that is planted sort of a metre away here. Much as many people love rowans, this rowan tree did not excite me. It just didn't do anything. It was supposed to be this tree that was full of berries and autumn colour, but it just never really leafed out sufficiently to have any autumn colour. If it did have the autumn colour, it just dropped its leaves really quickly. I wish I could tell you which rowan tree it was, so that, in fact, if I can find the information from our order form, I'll put it up on the screen, but apologies if I can't. But I didn't love it, and I wouldn't recommend it. But we have moved it, and we've just moved it to an area, in fact, next to the Monterey pine, where it's going to be at the back of a deep border, and, you know, when it's in leaf, it will create a bit of structure. But if it's not, it doesn't matter, because, in fact, on the other side of that wall in next door's garden, they've got some greenery there anyway. So I'll put up with it there. Maybe it'll be happier in that spot, I don't know, but it wasn't happy here. But the unfortunate thing about that was that we had to dig a massive hole to get the rowan tree out. When I say we, again, it was Richard. So we had to dig a huge hole to get the rowan tree out, but I didn't want to put this lovely Scots pine in exactly the same spot. I needed it moved slightly because I want something else to go there. So this is the pathway here, and the rowan tree was right at the very end of that, and I just didn't want to put an evergreen tree there. I want something with a bit more colour to go at the end of the path there. So it's going to be like a smaller shrub or something, because otherwise this tree is just going to knock it over eventually when it grows. But I'll figure that out in the very near future. But that's why I didn't want this tree right at the end of that path, because I want a different focal point. It's really important when you're planting a tree to make sure that you dig the hole much wider than the pot that it's coming out of, so that you give the roots room to spread out and you encourage the plant to spread its roots out. If you dig a really small hole, it's just going to kind of stay in its neat little space. So it is important to dig up a hole much wider. It doesn't have to be much deeper. What we did though was at the bottom of the hole, we loosened some of the soil and mixed in some farmyard manure into that, well composted farmyard manure. And the reason we did that is because the pine trees in general like free draining soil, so they can tolerate dry, and actually with clay soil, which we have, is going to be very heavy and it might retain a lot of moisture. So not only did we plant these trees quite proud of the ground, but I also made sure that we put some compost at the bottom. Now, you don't want to feed pine trees, but it is important to make sure that the roots have got somewhere to go and that they're not sitting in a puddle of water. So if you've got heavy soil like me, then you're going to need to amend it somehow without adding too much goodness. Once we'd loosened that bit of soil at the bottom of the hole and mixed in a bit of farmyard manure, we then also watered that area, not particularly heavily, but just sufficient to create some moisture, because we haven't had rain for such a long time. We then placed the tree and decided which way round we wanted it, and sprinkled some mycorrhizal fungi in the bottom of the hole, but also tried to get it on the roots. And you'll see that as Richard is planting the tree and trying to get it in the hole, that what we did was we encouraged the roots to sort of spread out a bit by just raking our hand through the bottom of the root ball and around the sides, just breaking up some of those little roots there. I mean, they really weren't pot bound at all, which is excellent, but it is a good idea to just sort of encourage the roots to spread out a bit. Once the trees were in the hole, all we did was we backfilled the hole with the surrounding compost that we'd taken out of the hole, so the native soil. Try to use native soil, because if you just fill your hole with just compost, it's not going to encourage your tree to spread its roots out much beyond the really rich compost that you've added, and it just won't anchor as quickly. So if you want to encourage the tree to spread its roots out, then you really want to use your native soil. We did add a tiny bit of, like half a bag of farmyard manure to the native soil, but that's only because we have heavy clay soil and I just wanted to give it a bit of a lightness, I suppose, to help with drainage and things like that. And then once we planted the tree and firmed it in with our heels, we watered again, and this time we watered really well, soaked the root ball, watered the whole area around the hole, and then we covered the area that we'd dug up, which is about at least 1 metre square. We covered that with bags of farmyard manure. The reason we did that is twofold. It's firstly to keep the moisture in, but it's also to stop the weeds growing. And Richard is under really strict instructions to make sure these areas are weeded really well throughout the season. We also have to keep on top of the watering. So if it doesn't rain in the next few days, then we will definitely be giving them a really good water again this weekend, and so forth. So when you're planting trees, the first season, that first year, you've really got to stay on top of the watering. Obviously with pine trees, as I've said, they don't want to be, sitting in a great big puddle. So do make sure that you're not over watering. So when I say, stay on top of the watering, you do need to check whether they need water before you water them, and just be really aware of how much it's rained, in your garden. for today. I think I've told you everything about these 2 pine trees that we've chosen, but if you've got any questions about them or how we planted them or looking after evergreens, then do pop them in the comments below and I'll get back to you. And if you've enjoyed this video, then please give it a like and subscribe to my channel if you'd like to see some more. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all next time. It's a gorgeous day this weekend, and why I chose these plants. Stumbling over my words, stumbling. And pine trees make the softest. It's really not relevant, is it? Why is this thing flashing at me? What does it keep saying? There are people putting up scaffolding next door. They're very noisy.